الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن سيدنا ومولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله تعالى عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه وسلم تسليما كثيرا كثيرا. أما بعد، فقد قال الله تبارك وتعالى في القرآن المجيد والفرقان الحميد: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم، بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة وإن كانوا من قبل لفي ضلال مبين. وقال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم: إنما بعثت لأتمم مكارم الأخلاق. صدق الله العظيم وصدق رسوله النبي الكريم. Respected brothers and sisters, I started speaking last week about education and the priorities of education. And I spoke last week about the way in which education, is Islamic education in particular, is organized and delivered to the Muslim community in the UK. Alright, and covered most of the models, probably the majority of the models that exist. Today I want to talk about some principles of education that we can perhaps think about. Right? These are not, cast in stone. These are some of my thoughts in my time in 20 years in education. But these can impact us in lots of different ways. So one thing is they will impact our education systems, how education systems are set up, how teachers teach in the classroom, and so on. But these are also important to consider when it comes to how we impart education as parents, how we prioritize the educational needs of our children, right? And again, I want to be very clear that I'm talking about Islamic educational needs. There is an equally important conversation to be had just about education in general, right? But we're talking about Islamic education, which I think, I am convinced is certainly something that we have collectively neglected to at least deliver to our children. Let's be careful with my words here, right? To deliver to our children to the same standards at which they enjoy their secular education. I think you can all agree with me on that. Yes? Which then also suggests that we also have not delivered Islamic education to our children. And I'm talking across the board here, collectively, right? As parents, as educators, as imams, as ulama, as leaders, etc., etc. That we have not also, therefore, given the same level of emphasis and importance to our children's Islamic education, collectively, as we have done to their secular education. Because if we gave the same level of importance, then we would also strive to achieve the same standards. Does that make sense? Right. So I want to talk now a little bit about some of these principles as just headers for reflection. Okay. So I have 5 to discuss. There's lots, right? So this is not exhaustive, but I think this is, if you like, responsive to our situation. These 5 are responsive to our situation. If you like, they're principles of reform in Islamic education, right? Which is quite an important contextual point as far as our work here in our masjid. So firstly is an obvious one, that all our education has to be systematic, right? Even as parents, when we think about how we talk to our children and how we educate them about certain things, there has to be some organization to this, right? For example, if you're a parent and you're having conversations about religion with your children, then an aspect of being systematic is to have age-appropriate conversations. Does that make sense? Right? So, you shouldn't be having conversations with your 5-year-old that are more appropriate to a 10-year-old or more appropriate to a 15-year-old. Everything isn't for everybody at the same time. Imagine if you had that attitude about food. Right? Would you feed your newborn kebabs? So it's the same principle. Yeah? So that's just an example of just one part of what I mean by that. But my general point is that, education has to be provided based on rational and a strong rational and epistemological foundations. It can't be haphazard and delivered without any consideration for how all of it comes together, how it all makes sense, how it coheres, right? So that's being systematic at a philosophical level, right? So similarly, what we teach has to be organized in a logical fashion. So, for example, age appropriateness would be a significant factor here. So sometimes I have conversations about certain things with people, and they're like, we're struggling with our youth, etc. We're struggling with our children about these issues and so on and so forth. And I'm like, okay, so how old are your children? Oh, they're 5. So I'm like, no, you've got a few years to go. Talk to me about, have a separate conversation with me about 5-year-olds. Do you see what I mean? It's like sometimes when you use words like children, when you use words like youth, when you use words like teenagers, sometimes these words somehow all mean the same thing. They don't, right? They are very specific words addressing specific age groups with specific educational, intellectual, emotional, psychological needs that have to be taken into consideration when we have our conversations, when we deliver our education and so on. When we set priorities in instruction, in education, in parenting, right, we have to take into consideration the priorities of the Sharia and not act according to the demands of culture. I'll give you one example of that. It's a bit of a pet issue, right, and you're all going to end up with mixed thoughts about this, and you're going to talk about it behind my back, but that's okay, right? It's anything that to trigger the discussion and the debate is good, inshallah. Our attitude towards teaching Quran, right? Our attitude towards teaching Quran. So we teach Quran to children from the moment they enter through the doors of a madrasa. It's the first thing that a parent thinks about when they're thinking, how do I make sure my child learns Islam, right? Islam to us, for most people, at the basic level, Islam equals teaching Quran. Right? But then, in a strange twist of cultural kind of mishmash of priorities, what we mean by Quran is not what the Quran teaches, not what the Quran means, not what the Quran says, what the Quran inspires. What we mean by that is how to read the Quran without understanding any of it. Right? That is the priority. That is the priority from the moment a child, is sent to a teacher to teach Quran. As long as the Quran, we can't even call it Quran education. As long as the Quran reading education is going well, we assume everything else is going well. That is the one we check. When we come knock on the masjid door, how's my child's Quran going? Not, is he reciting it really nicely? Is he reciting it well? Is he reciting it with tajweed? Is he understanding any of it? No. How much has he done? When is my child going to be on Quran? On Quran means, like, has he passed the alphabet and done the qaida, and are they about to take sabaq onto the Quran? That's basically the question. That's the priority. So that is although I'm picking on this issue, right, it's a good one to pick on actually, but this is a very good example, right, of how priorities, how just how things have been, right, just cultural legacy sets our priorities in a way that actually defies all considerations to logical thought, all considerations to pedagogy, all considerations given to any kind of systematic engagement with an educational objective. Right? And most importantly, it gives no consideration to religious priorities. Reading the Quran, other than what you have to read in your salah, right, is a mustahab. Does that make sense? The mustahab. Now, it has a secondary importance. The secondary importance is it is important to our connection with our deen. It is important to our connection with our spirituality. It is important to the concept of thawab and reward, because we know that we get reward for reciting the Quran, etc., etc. But it is not as high on the priority as making sure that our children learn salah with khushu', for example. Learn to perform salah in a way that connects them to the prayer. It is not as important to our children, for example, understanding clearly what the Quran teaches in terms of beliefs and practices and worldview. It is not as important to our children having the found principles of Iman firmly embedded in their hearts. Right? It is not as important as our children learning Islamic akhlaq and manners and etiquettes. Right? And honestly, I always use this. If you guys were all Ofsted inspectors, right? Dare I use the name Ofsted, right? If you were all Ofsted inspectors and you then were like, okay, let's now prioritize educational needs based on what Islam says the priorities are. Then let's go and inspect our education. I'm telling you, the findings will not be good. Right? Why? Because you can't lay blame. We're all collectively to blame. The poor teacher can't decide on his priorities because he's being told what to teach based on cultural priorities, based on what mum and dad want to boast about to their friends. So as much as the teacher might be wanting to teach a particular way, the curriculum priorities are being set according to the demands of the community. And the community wants khatam. The community wants Quran khatam. Right? So then it's like, okay, well, what's going on with the Quran then? Or but with our salah we're doing this, but what about Quran? What about Quran? You understand my point? And I'll give you just one simple, nobody's saying Quran shouldn't be taught. What I'm saying is that Quran can be taught with tajweed properly, right? If, for example, it is taught systematically the way reading is taught for almost every other language in the world, right? Taught at an age where the ideas and people's ability to recognize letters and pronounce letters, etc., is a bit more developed, not at the age of 4, at the age of 5. It's a bit more developed. You want to teach Arabic to kids at the age of 4 or 5, do you know what you should teach? What should you teach? If you want to teach Arabic to children at the age of 4 or 5, what should you teach? Language. Who said that? Thank you. You should teach language. If you want to teach children Arabic at the age of 4 or 5, teach them language. They'll enjoy it much more, it'll be much more fulfilling, and it will contribute to later on being able to fast track their reading of the Quran. Just one example of how not thinking about education in a systematic way can result in a complete, upside down set of priorities. Just one little example, right? Yet here we are, we keep doing this. There are people in this room who, despite me saying this to you today, right, you're going to be thinking, you're going to go home and you're going to be thinking about when your child is going to do their Quran Khatam. Right? What's a Quran Khatam? What is that as an objective? Is that an educational necessity? Is it necessary to do a Khatam of the Quran for your child to be reading the Quran fluently? The Quran reading can be awful. They can still do a Khatam of the Quran. It can be awful. They can do a Khatam of the Quran. So, what's going on here? You see my point? So, we have to allow our priorities to be set according to the priorities of Islam. The priorities of the deen. That's what has to prioritize how we establish our educational priorities. Right? Including as parents with our children. Okay, principle number 2, because I want to run out of time. Our education has to be responsive. I'm going to keep this brief, but this is really, really important. Responsive. Responsive. What does that mean? Okay. I want to read this one out. I wrote these out because I've been talking about them for so long. And usually I talk about them to teachers, to ulama and people like that. Our education, both, remember, parents, teachers, education providers, right, as everyone, it must respond to the ideas and circumstances that are challenging Iman. The ideas and circumstances that are challenging Iman. Circumstances like peer pressure, for example, is a circumstantial thing, right? So the ideas and circumstances that are challenging Iman, and it must be relevant to lived realities. For example, so a simple example of that is you can't be teaching people the rules of water based on wells and ponds when they use taps. You understand? Simple example, right? Obviously, there's any number of examples of this. Ideas cover. I'll give you a really good example, right? We can teach Islam to our children in a way that takes into consideration the fact that our children also go to school in the morning. Yes? And we can teach Islam in a way that complements their school education. So because they are attending weekend Islamic school or evening Islamic school, the way evening Islamic school is delivered, weekend Islamic school is delivered, it actually makes them better at school. It actually makes them better at school. So if you set that as an objective, then you can start thinking about, okay, what can we do to deliver that? What can we do to make that a reality? That's how you take into consideration the realities lived by our children. We can't be blind to the rest of the child's life. And the same is true with your conversations and your thoughts about education as a parent. So, when we say ideas, this covers a broad spectrum, but circumstances and contextual needs must also be considered, and this needs to touch on what difficulties are they facing in life, in school, issues of how do they respond to bullying, things like that, right? So the difficulties in their iman, how are they being affected by liberal society? Right? How does that affect their Islamic worldview? Is it affecting them in any way? Does it pose a challenge? Does it not pose a challenge? Culture. Are there aspects of our own cultures that are turning them away from Islam, that are getting in the way of their Islam? These are all things to think about, right? Peer pressure, media influence, social media influence, right? Socioeconomics, how does that affect them? Right? Psychological needs, emotional well-being, and all of this stuff, right? Number 3, I have to now wrap up, right? Number 3, education needs to be transformational. Education needs to be transformational. That means it can't just be the imparting of information. Education can't just be about making children memorize information. It has to actually change their life, right? So, what does that mean? Part of teaching Aqidah, right, must involve thinking about how is teaching Aqidah to a child going to boost their Iman and inspire action and change, right? For example, it might be worth looking at when muhaddithun compile hadiths under the heading Kitabul Iman. What kind of hadith do they compile? They don't compile hadiths that say, we believe in X, Y, and Z. They compile hadiths that talk about things like the sweetness of Iman, that talk about loving one another, that talk about love of Allah, love of Allah's Messenger. That's very different to, as Muslims, we believe in X, Y, and Z. You see what I mean? That's more transformational. It's more transformative. All right? We don't even have to look at modern pedagogy. Look at how the earliest muhaddithun compiled a hadith under the heading Iman. They didn't there were theological contents in there, but a lot of it was Iman as a transformative form of teaching. Okay? Right. They talk about alamatul nifaq, etc. Education must focus on akhlaq and adat. How does the Islamic education that I provide a child, or you provide your children, or we provide our children in madrasas and maktabs, how does it improve their character? Does it improve their character? Where does their good Islamic character come from? Right? Is a big question. Number 4, unifying. Education has to be unifying. I'm literally going to read this out because we're out of time, right? So how can education be unifying? So education has to avoid, and this is you as parents as well, me as an imam, we as each other. Think about this. We have to avoid unnecessary focus on sectarian schisms, sectarian differences, all right? And such narratives. We need to direct. So, for example, when you talk sectarian, it usually starts by people being directed to the speaker. A sectarian narrative directs people to the speaker, right? And to the speaker's background. What is the imam's background? What is the teacher's background? What is this? What is that? Unifying narratives direct people to universals, to principles, to the teachings of Islam and so on. To Allah and His Messenger, to the certainties of Islam such as piety, goodness, akhlaq, and that which is absolute and known by necessity in the deen. So we prioritize these principles and eradicate as much as possible the former. And whenever there's legitimate difference of opinion, like the difference of opinions in the four schools and so on and so forth, we rationalize those in an effective way, rather than in a sectarian way. Oh, we're Hanafis, they're Shafi'is, we can't do that, and we can't have this kind of dismissive attitude towards legitimate difference of opinion. When we even talk about legitimate difference of opinion, we have to have a kind of unifying attitude. A unifying attitude towards it, and that's what our children need to get from their education, right? Not one which kind of literally from the outset teaches. Some people do it differently. Be careful of those. Be careful of them. And those people are following legitimate kind of opinions in Islamic theology or in Islamic law. Okay? And lastly, education. And all of our conversations with our children have to be orientational. I don't know if that's the right word. What I mean is the way we talk to our children, the way we educate our children has to give them a way of thinking. Not just a way of doing things. Not just things to do, but a way of thinking, a worldview, an outlook, and orientation. Right? Otherwise, it's effectively what happens is you can have a person being a practicing Muslim, apparently, for all intents and purposes, they're a practicing Muslim, but they don't think like a Muslim at all. They don't think like a Muslim at all. They're a capitalist, materialist, individualist, secularist, socialist, they're a nationalist, they're all of those things in their worldview. What does it mean to be a Muslim in your worldview? It never occurs to them. Never occurs to them. Does that make sense? So these are just some thoughts, brothers and sisters, just some thoughts, right, about how we should conduct the business of education, right, as parents, as educators, as teachers, as imams, as communities thinking about education. Just some thoughts, inshallah ta'ala. I focused on top level stuff because I don't want to create a rod for my back and say specifics, because you're going to be like, oh, you said in the khutbah that you're going to do this, why haven't you done it? These are just some general thoughts. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين من كل ذنب فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم.